Alright, let's go. Number 10. The Toba supervolcano and the genetic bottleneck. Approximately 74,000 years ago, on what is now the Indonesian island of Sumatra, the Earth experienced one of the most violent geological events in the last 2 million years. The Toba supervolcano erupted with a force estimated at magnitude 8 on the Volcanic Explosivity Index, the highest classification possible. The eruption ejected approximately 2,800 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, roughly 100 times more than the catastrophic Mount Tambora eruption of 1815, which itself caused the infamous year without a summer across the Northern Hemisphere. Toba was not a disaster. It was an extinction-level event that humanity barely survived. The blast was so powerful that ash from the eruption has been found in sediment layers across the entire Indian Ocean and as far away as East Africa, more than 7,000 kilometers from the volcano itself. Geologists studying ash layers across the Indian Ocean and South Asia have traced the fallout from the Toba eruption across thousands of kilometers. In central India, ash deposits from this single event reached depths of 6 meters in some locations, blanketing the subcontinent in a layer of volcanic debris that suffocated plant life and collapsed entire ecosystems. The eruption injected massive quantities of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere, creating a global cooling event that climate scientists call a volcanic winter. Temperatures plummeted across the planet by an estimated 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. Now, with some regions experiencing drops far more severe. The cooling lasted for years, possibly decades. Forests died. Rivers froze in latitudes that had never seen ice. The sky itself turned the color of bruised iron, and the sun became a dim red disk that gave no warmth. But here's where the horror becomes personal. Geneticist Stanley Ambrose at the University of Illinois proposed in 1998 that the Toba eruption corresponds with a mysterious genetic bottleneck in human DNA. Studies of mitochondrial DNA suggest that around 70,000 years ago, the entire human population may have collapsed to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 reproducing individuals. Every human alive today, all 8 billion of us, descends from this catastrophically small surviving group. We are not the descendants of a thriving global species. We are the descendants of refugees who watched their world end. Every gene in your body, every trait you inherited, every feature of your face traces back to a few thousand survivors who somehow lived through a catastrophe that should have erased our species from the planet. The implications are staggering. Before Toba, anatomically modern humans had spread across Africa and into parts of the Middle East. They had developed tools, language, social structures, and the cognitive capacity that defines our species. Then, a single volcano in Indonesia nearly erased all of it. The cooling and the resulting drought transformed habitable savannas into wastelands. Food sources vanished. Water became scarce. Human populations crashed across continents. For thousands of years afterward, our ancestors clung to existence in scattered refugia, isolated pockets of survivable territory where they hunted, foraged, and waited for a world that wasn't trying to kill them. Some groups never recovered. Their bloodlines simply ended, their last members dying alone in caves and shelters that archaeologists would not discover for tens of thousands of years. What makes this event particularly disturbing is how close we came to never existing at all. A breeding population of a few thousand individuals is dangerously small. Genetic diversity collapses, harmful mutations accumulate, and a single additional disaster can finish what the first one started. Conservation biologists, today, consider any species with a population of less than 5,000 to be critically endangered. We were below that threshold. Every disease, every climate fluctuation, every predator encountered during those millennia could have ended the human story permanently. The fact that you exist to hear this is the result of a survival event so improbable that it should not have happened. Something in our ancestors refused to die, and you are the evidence of their refusal. The Toba eruption did not just shape human history. nearly ended it, and the silence of the millions of bloodlines that did not survive is the loudest absence in our genetic record. Number 9. The megafauna apocalypse and the Great Silence. For most of human history, our ancestors shared the earth with animals so massive, so strange, and so terrifying that modern wildlife seems impoverished by comparison. During the Pleistocene epoch, which began approximately 2.6 million years ago and ended only 11,700 years ago, the continents were dominated by megafauna. Giant ground sloths the size of elephants roamed the Americas. Mammoths and mastodons trampled across Eurasia and North America. Cave bears stood 3 meters tall. Dire wolves hunted in packs across the Western Hemisphere. Saber-toothed cats with canines as long as a human forearm stalked prey across grasslands that no longer exist. The world was loud with the calls of giants, and the ground itself trembled under the weight of creatures that have no living equivalents on Earth today. Then, with terrifying speed, almost all of them vanished. The extinction event that ended the Pleistocene megafauna remains one of the most debated topics in paleontology. Between roughly 50,000 and 10,000 years ago, depending on the continent, an estimated 65% of all large mammal species on Earth went extinct. In North America alone, 35 genera of large mammals disappeared in what amounts to a geological instant. South America lost 50 genera. Australia lost 88% of its megafauna. Only Africa, where the animals had co-evolved with hominins for millions of years, retained most of its giants. Everywhere else, the great beasts were systematically erased from existence. The fossil record shows their bones piling up in specific layers, then nothing. The world that had existed for millions of years simply stopped, as if a curtain had fallen across an entire era of life on Earth. What makes this extinction particularly unsettling is the suspect. The pattern of die-offs correlates with stunning precision to the arrival of modern humans. When our ancestors reached Australia approximately 65,000 years ago, the continent's megafauna collapsed within a few thousand years. When humans crossed into the Americas around 15,000 years ago, the same pattern repeated. Mammoths, mastodons, giant beavers, short-faced bears, all of them gone within a geological blink of human arrival. Climate change played a role. Shifting habitats certainly contributed, but the correlation between human migration and megafaunal extinction is so consistent across continents that paleontologists increasingly point to a darker conclusion. We hunted them to extinction. The pattern is too clean, too precise, and too repeatable to be coincidence. The implications reshape our understanding of what humans are. We did not enter a stable natural world and find our place within it. We arrived as the most efficient predators ever to evolve, and we systematically dismantled ecosystems that had existed for millions of years. Coordinated hunting parties using fire, traps, and projectile weapons could bring down animals weighing several tons. Our ancestors were not the gentle stewards of myth. They were apex predators who hunted creatures so massive that their disappearance reshaped entire landscapes. The grasslands of North America exist in their current form because we killed the animals that maintained them. The forests of South America grew differently because we erased the giant herbivores that had pruned them for millions of years. We did not adapt to the world. We rebuilt it through extinction. The truly horrifying aspect is what we lost. Imagine standing in a forest 20,000 years ago and watching a giant ground sloth, 6 meters tall, peacefully stripping leaves from a tree. Imagine the thunder of mammoth herds crossing tundra that stretched from Spain to Siberia. Imagine the silence that fell across continents as these creatures vanished one by one, the absence of footprints that had shaken the ground for millions of years. Modern humans have never known a wild world. The Earth we inherited is a depleted version of what existed before us, a quiet planet where the greatest beasts have already been exterminated. And the predator that emptied the forests is still here. It is reading this script. It is you. Every human alive today carries the genetic legacy of the most successful exterminator the planet has ever produced. And the silence of the extinct megafauna is the price our ancestors paid for our survival. Number 8. The Ice Age that almost ended everything. Approximately 115,000 years ago, the Earth entered the most recent Ice Age, a period geologists call the last glacial period. For the next 100,000 years, our planet would be locked in a cycle of advancing and retreating ice sheets that fundamentally reshaped every continent and nearly destroyed every human population that tried to survive in the northern latitudes. At its peak, around 26,500 years ago, the ice sheets covered approximately 25% of Earth's land surface. Glaciers 2 miles thick crushed entire mountain ranges into gravel. Sea levels dropped by approximately 120 meters as massive amounts of water became locked in ice. Continental shelves emerged from the oceans, creating land bridges and exposing terrain that had been submerged for millions of years. The world map of the last ice age would be unrecognizable to us today, with continents joined by walking routes and oceans pulled back from coastlines that no longer exist. The conditions facing prehistoric humans during this period were almost incomprehensible. In Europe, the ice front extended as far south as modern-day Germany and Poland. Beyond the glaciers stretched a vast belt of permafrost tundra, a frozen wasteland where temperatures regularly fell below -40 degrees Celsius for months at a time. The wind across these landscapes carried ice crystals at velocities that could flay exposed skin. Trees vanished from most of the Northern Hemisphere. The world that our ancestors knew, a world of forests and seasonal warmth, was replaced by an alien planet of ice deserts and stone. Fresh water existed only as ice that had to be melted with precious fuel. Game animals were scarce and migratory, forcing humans to follow them across distances that took entire seasons to traverse. But here's where the story becomes a testament to something almost unbelievable about our species. Humans did not retreat. They adapted. Archaeological evidence from sites across Europe and Siberia reveals that Homo sapiens and Neanderthals not only survived these conditions, they thrived in them. They developed tailored clothing using bone needles, the earliest of which date to approximately 50,000 years ago. They built shelters from mammoth bones, structures so large and elaborate that they required dozens of individuals working together to construct. They invented fat lamps to provide light during the months-long polar nights. They created art on cave walls deep underground, leaving handprints and animal paintings in chambers where temperatures remained survivable year-round. They learned to render fat from bones and to preserve meat through freezing, and they did all of this without metal tools, without written language, and without any guidance from previous generations who had faced the same conditions. What makes the last glacial period particularly disturbing is what it reveals about the precarity of human existence during this era. Recent genetic studies suggest that the human population in Europe may have collapsed to just a few thousand individuals during the coldest periods, hanging on in isolated refugia in southern France, Iberia, and the Italian peninsula. Entire populations were wiped out as the ice advanced. Communities that had existed for thousands of years vanished without descendants, their languages, cultures, and bloodlines erased from history. We have no record of who they were. We only know they died because the genetic record shows they have no living descendants. Their tools have been found in caves long since reclaimed by ice. Their bones have been discovered in shelters where they froze to death, waiting for a spring that never came in their lifetimes. The truly horrifying aspect is the duration. This wasn't a catastrophe that struck once and ended. The last glacial period lasted longer than the entire span of recorded human history, multiplied by 20. For nearly 100,000 years, our ancestors lived in conditions that should have been incompatible with survival. They watched generation after generation grow up in a frozen world, knowing nothing else. They buried their dead in ice. They told stories around fires fueled by bone and fat. They produced children who would never see a temperate forest. And they kept going, century after century, until finally, around 11,700 years ago, the climate began to warm. The descendants of the survivors emerged into a new world, carrying with them the genetic memory of suffering on a scale we can no longer comprehend. Every modern human north of the equator descends from people who endured something that should have killed them. And the comfort of your heated room is a luxury that took 100,000 years of frozen death to make possible. Number 7. The Younger Dryas and the Lost Civilization Question. Around 12,900 years ago, just as the Earth was finally emerging from the last ice age and humans were beginning to enjoy a warming, stabilizing climate, something catastrophic happened. The temperature in the Northern Hemisphere plunged back into glacial conditions almost overnight. Within a few decades, possibly within a single human lifetime, the climate that had been gently warming for thousands of years collapsed. Greenland ice cores reveal that average temperatures in some regions dropped by as much as 10 degrees Celsius. The world that our ancestors had been adapting to suddenly turned hostile again. This 1,200-year cold snap is called the Younger Dryas, and it remains one of the most mysterious climate events in Earth's recent history. The cause of the Younger Dryas has been debated for decades. The leading mainstream theory suggests that the collapse of an enormous ice dam in North America released a massive flood of cold freshwater into the North Atlantic, disrupting ocean currents and triggering rapid cooling. But in 2007, a team of scientists led by Richard Firestone proposed something far more dramatic. They argued that the Younger Dryas was triggered by a cosmic impact, a comet or asteroid that struck or exploded above the North American ice sheet, igniting continental wildfires and throwing enough debris into the atmosphere to plunge the world back into glacial conditions. Evidence for this hypothesis includes a layer of nanodiamonds, melted glass, and unusual platinum concentrations found at sites across multiple continents, all dating to precisely the start of the Younger Dryas. The geological signature of the boundary layer reads like the aftermath of an explosion that shook the entire planet at once. What makes the Younger Dryas particularly unsettling is what humanity was doing when it happened. Just before the cooling began, archaeological evidence suggests that human cultures across the Near East and parts of Asia were on the verge of a revolutionary transformation. The Natufian culture in the Levant had begun experimenting with agriculture, building permanent settlements, and developing the social structures that would eventually give rise to civilization. Then the Younger Dryas struck. The Natufians collapsed. Their settlements were abandoned. Populations crashed. Whatever proto-civilizations had been emerging were erased. The archaeological record shows a sudden break, a layer of abandonment that separates what came before from what came after, and the people who survived emerged into a world that had forgotten what their grandparents had built. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. Some researchers, looking at the archaeological gaps and the strange folklore of flood myths that appear in cultures around the world, have proposed that something more was lost during the Younger Dryas. They argue that prehistoric humanity may have achieved levels of cultural and technological sophistication that we have completely failed to recognize, and that the cosmic impact and resulting cataclysm wiped these achievements from the record. The flood myths of Mesopotamia, the legends of Atlantis, the stories told by cultures separated by oceans about a great inundation that destroyed an earlier world. Or these tales might not be inventions. They might be memories. They might be the fragmentary recollections of a catastrophe so vast that the survivors spent the next 12,000 years trying to explain what had happened to their grandparents. The implications are staggering. If even a fraction of this hypothesis is correct, then human history is far longer and stranger than we have been taught. There may have been entire chapters of our development that ended in fire and ice, leaving nothing behind but myths passed down through hundreds of generations. The survivors of the Younger Dryas would have started over, rebuilding from almost nothing, with only the dimmest memories of what had been lost. The agricultural revolution that followed the cold snap would not be the dawn of human civilization. It would be the second attempt. and we, the inheritors of that second attempt, may be living on the bones of a forgotten world, walking over ruins so ancient that we mistake them for natural features. Whatever knowledge our ancestors possessed before the sky fell is gone, locked away beneath sediment and ice, waiting in places we have not yet looked. Every time an archaeologist breaks ground in an unexplored region, the possibility remains that the next strike of the trowel will hit something that should not exist according to our current timeline of human development. Number 6. The Black Sea Deluge. Around 7,600 years ago, in a region that would later become the cradle of multiple ancient civilizations, the Earth performed an act of geological violence, so sudden and so vast that its memory may have echoed through human cultures for millennia. The Black Sea, which had existed as a freshwater lake during the Ice Age, was separated from the rising waters of the Mediterranean by a narrow strip of land in what is now the Bosphorus Strait. As global sea levels climbed in the wake of glacial melting, pressure built against this natural dam. Then, geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman of Columbia University proposed in 1997 the dam broke. What followed was one of the most catastrophic flooding events in human prehistory. The result was a flood unlike anything in recorded human experience. According to the Ryan-Pittman hypothesis, saltwater from the Mediterranean burst through the Bosphorus with a force estimated at 200 times the flow rate of Niagara Falls. The water poured into the Black Sea basin at a rate that may have raised the lake's level by approximately 15 centimeters per day. For months, possibly for years, the inundation continued. The freshwater lake was transformed into a salt sea. Coastlines that had supported human settlements for thousands of years were swallowed. An area larger than 100,000 square kilometers was submerged beneath the rising waters. The roar of the cataract would have been audible for hundreds of kilometers, a constant thunder that announced the death of the world to anyone who could hear it. What makes the Black Sea Deluge particularly disturbing is the human cost. The shores of the freshwater lake had been ideal territory for early agricultural communities. Fertile soil, abundant water, mild climate. Archaeological evidence suggests that thousands of people lived in settlements along the lake's edge. When the flood came, they had no warning. The geological evidence indicates that the rising waters advanced at speeds that would have been impossible to outrun with crops, livestock, and family members. Entire villages were drowned. Cultures that had spent generations developing agriculture, building homes, and burying their ancestors in family graves watched their world disappear beneath an advancing wall of seawater. The drowned settlements still exist today, preserved in the anoxic depths of the Black Sea, where divers and remote submersibles have discovered the outlines of structures and the artifacts of people who never made it to higher ground. The truly unsettling aspect is the diaspora that followed. Researchers who support the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis argue that the survivors of this catastrophe scattered in every direction, carrying their stories and their cultural innovations with them. Some traveled west into Europe. Others moved south into Mesopotamia. Still others went east toward the Caucasus. With them traveled the seeds of agriculture, the techniques of pottery, the early forms of writing, and with them traveled the memory of the flood. The story of a great inundation that destroyed an earlier world appears in the mythology of nearly every culture descended from this region. The Epic of Gilgamesh describes it. The Hebrew Bible records it as the flood of Noah. Greek mythology preserves it in the story of Deucalion. These narratives may not be parallel inventions. They may be a single memory, fractured and reshaped, of a catastrophe that actually happened to people whose descendants we are. What makes this particularly horrifying is the implication that human civilization, as we know it, was born from trauma. The agricultural revolution and the rise of the first cities did not occur in a vacuum of peaceful innovation. They occurred in the wake of a disaster that displaced thousands of people and forced them to start over in new lands. The earliest known cities of Mesopotamia emerged within centuries of the proposed Black Sea flood. Sumer, Uruk, the foundational settlements of recorded history, were built by populations that included the descendants of refugees from a vanished world. Civilization itself may be a coping mechanism. The walls and the temples and the writing systems were not built by people who felt secure in their world. They were built by people who knew, from the stories of their grandparents, that the world could end without warning, and that the only defense against forgetting was to carve memory into stone. Every monument we have ever built, every record we have ever kept, every ritual we have ever performed to remember the dead, may trace back to a single afternoon when the sea broke through the land and erased everything our ancestors had ever known. Number 5. The Neanderthal extinction and the ghost in our genome. Approximately 400,000 years ago, a hominin species emerged in Europe and Western Asia that would dominate those continents for the next 360,000 years. The Neanderthals were not the brutish cave dwellers of outdated stereotypes. They were intelligent, tool-making, fire-using, art-creating people who buried their dead with flowers, cared for their elderly and disabled, and developed sophisticated hunting techniques that allowed them to take down the largest prey animals of the Ice Age. Their brains were, on average, slightly larger than ours. Their bodies were stronger, more cold-adapted, and built for the brutal environments they called home. For hundreds of thousands of years, they were the most successful hominin species on Earth outside of Africa, and they had every reason to expect that the world belonged to them. Then, we arrived. And within a few thousand years, the Neanderthals were gone. The extinction of the Neanderthals occurred between approximately 40,000 and 28,000 years ago, coinciding precisely with the spread of anatomically modern humans into their territories. The last known Neanderthal populations clung to existence in the southernmost refugia of Iberia, and in caves overlooking the Mediterranean, before their final disappearance. The fossil record shows their numbers dwindling, their settlements shrinking, their territories collapsing inward as our ancestors expanded across Europe. They did not vanish gradually due to climate change alone. They vanished while sharing the continent with a competing species that hunted the same prey, occupied the same caves, and carried tools and techniques that may have been just slightly more efficient than their own. The mathematics of competition between two intelligent species occupying the same ecological niche has only one outcome, and the Neanderthals were on the wrong side of it. What makes the Neanderthal extinction particularly disturbing is what it reveals about our ancestors. We did not arrive in Europe as peaceful settlers seeking coexistence. We arrived as an invasive species, and we systematically replaced the people we found there. Genetic evidence reveals that there was interbreeding between modern humans and Neanderthals, and most non-African humans alive today carry between 1 and 4% Neanderthal DNA in their genomes. But this genetic legacy is not evidence of peaceful integration. It is the residue of a long contact period during which two species competed, occasionally interbred, and eventually one of them ceased to exist as a distinct population. The Neanderthals did not assimilate into modern humanity. They were absorbed and erased, leaving only fragments of themselves scattered through the DNA of the species that replaced them. The truly horrifying aspect is the silence that followed. For 360,000 years, Neanderthals had developed their own languages, and their own myths, their own ways of understanding the world. They had buried their dead in deliberate positions with grave goods, suggesting beliefs about an afterlife. They had painted in caves at sites like Maltravieso and La Pasiega, leaving handprints and abstract symbols that predate the cave art of modern humans by tens of thousands of years. All of that knowledge, all of that culture, all of those untold stories died with them. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what gods they prayed to. We do not know what they thought of the strange newcomers from the south who arrived with their pointed weapons and their hungry eyes. The last Neanderthal who ever lived died alone in a cave somewhere, the final witness to a civilization that had endured for hundreds of thousands of years. And there was no one of their kind left to mourn them. What makes this final detail so unsettling is the proximity. The last Neanderthals died only about 28,000 years ago. That is recent enough that their footprints still exist in caves, that their tools still rest in undisturbed soil, that the soot from their fires still stains the ceilings of the rock shelters where they lived. They were here. They were people. They were us, in a sense, sharing 99.7% of our DNA, and we replaced them. The ghost in our genome is the genetic memory of a species that lost a war they may not have known they were fighting, and every modern human of European or Asian descent carries a small fragment of those vanished people inside them, a biological echo of the world we inherited by erasing the people who had it first. Number 4. The African mega-drought. Between approximately 135,000 and 75,000 years ago, the African continent experienced a series of climate catastrophes that nearly killed the species that would eventually become humanity. Lake sediment cores from East Africa, particularly from Lake Malawi, reveal evidence of prolonged droughts so severe that the Great Lakes of the Rift Valley shrank to a fraction of their normal size. Lake Malawi, today one of the largest lakes in the world, may have lost more than 95% of its water during the worst of these dry periods. The savannas that had supported early human populations for hundreds of thousands of years transformed into deserts. The animals that humans hunted vanished or migrated away. The water sources that humans depended on became poisonous, salty puddles surrounded by the bones of those who had tried to drink from them. The cause of the African mega-drought remains debated, but the consequences are written into the geological and genetic records with brutal clarity. Climate scientists believe that orbital variations in the Earth's tilt, combined with changes in atmospheric circulation patterns, caused massive shifts in monsoon systems across Africa. Rainfall patterns that had supported human life for tens of thousands of years simply collapsed. Entire regions that had been habitable became uninhabitable within a few generations. Populations of early humans that had been spreading across the continent were forced to retreat into a small number of refugia, ecological islands where water and food remained available, be surrounded by vast stretches of dead land that no human could cross. What makes the African mega-drought particularly disturbing is what it forced our ancestors to do. Genetic evidence suggests that during the worst of these dry periods, the human population in Africa may have collapsed to just a few hundred breeding individuals concentrated in a handful of survivable locations. One of these refugia may have been along the southern coast of what is now South Africa, in a region called Pinnacle Point. Archaeological excavations at sites in this region have revealed something extraordinary. The humans who survived there did so by completely transforming their relationship with the environment. They began harvesting shellfish from the tidal zones. They developed advanced stone tool techniques. They used pigments, so possibly for body decoration or symbolic purposes. They were the first humans to exploit marine resources on a sustained basis, and the techniques they developed during the mega-drought may have been the foundation of all later human cultural evolution. The truly horrifying aspect is the bottleneck this created. For tens of thousands of years, humanity may have been confined to a strip of coastline thousands of kilometers from the savannas where our species had first emerged. The interior of Africa was largely empty of humans. The vast majority of our potential territory was uninhabitable. If those few hundred survivors at Pinnacle Point and similar refugia had failed, if a single bad storm or disease outbreak had wiped them out, the entire human story would have ended before it had truly begun. There would be no ancient Egypt, no Roman Empire, no Renaissance, no Industrial Revolution, no civilization at all. The future of our species was concentrated in the hands of a few hundred people clinging to a coastline at the edge of a dying continent, and they had no idea that the survival of every human being who would ever live depended on them. What makes this particularly unsettling is the implication for who we are, the cognitive and behavioral traits that define modern humanity. The symbolic thinking, the artistic expression, the complex social structures may not be the result of gradual evolution in a stable environment. They may be the result of intense selection pressure during the mega-drought. The humans who survived were the ones who could think abstractly enough to recognize new food sources, communicate complex ideas about marine harvesting, and cooperate in groups large enough to defend their refugia. We are not the descendants of average humans. We are the descendants of the most adaptable, most creative, and most desperate survivors of a near-extinction event. The traits that allow you to read this script, to understand abstract concepts, to imagine the past and the future, were forged in the fire of a catastrophe that almost ended us. And the rest of humanity, the ones who could not adapt, died on the dry plains where their bones remain unburied. Number 3. The Great Cannibal Winter. Between approximately 45,000 and 30,000 years ago, during the final phase of the last ice age, evidence began appearing in the archaeological record that points to one of the darkest chapters in human prehistory. Excavations at sites across Europe, including Gough's Cave in England, Der Krapina in Croatia, and Goyet Cave in Belgium, have revealed human bones bearing the unmistakable marks of butchery. Cut marks consistent with the removal of flesh. Crack patterns indicating that long bones were broken open to access the marrow. Skulls modified into drinking vessels. The evidence is not isolated. It is widespread, consistent, and undeniable. During the worst periods of the Ice Age, our ancestors ate each other. The interpretation of prehistoric cannibalism is complex and disputed. Some archaeologists argue that the practice was ritualistic, a way of honoring the dead by incorporating them into the bodies of the living. Others suggest it was a desperate response to starvation when other food sources had failed. The truth is probably both, depending on the time, the place, and the people involved. But the sheer quantity of evidence indicates that cannibalism was not a rare aberration in prehistoric human societies. It was a widespread practice that occurred across multiple continents, in multiple time periods, and among multiple hominin species, including both modern humans and Neanderthals. The bones of our ancestors are scattered across cave floors with the same butchery marks we find on the bones of the animals they hunted. What makes prehistoric cannibalism particularly disturbing is what it reveals about the conditions our ancestors faced. The Ice Age was not a uniform period of difficult survival. It was punctuated by episodes of catastrophic resource collapse, during which entire human populations faced the choice between starvation and the unthinkable. When the migrating herds failed to arrive, when the cold killed the plants, when the snow buried the world for months at a time, the only protein available was the bodies of those who had already died. Genetic evidence in some modern human populations even shows the lingering signature of widespread cannibalism in the form of prion disease resistance, mutations that protected against the brain diseases that arise from consuming infected human tissue. We carry in our DNA the biological evidence that our ancestors ate human brains often enough that natural selection adapted us to survive the consequences. The truly horrifying aspect is the social cost. Cannibalism was not simply a matter of consuming bodies that had died of natural causes. The evidence at some sites suggests that humans were killed specifically for food. The butchery patterns are too systematic, the bone collections too organized, the demographic patterns too suspicious. Children's bones appear at some sites alongside those of adults, treated with the same processing techniques used for game animals. Entire communities may have turned on themselves during the worst periods. The strong consuming the weak, the living consuming the dying, and the survivors carrying with them the memory of what they had done to make it through another winter. What makes this particularly unsettling is the silence that followed. The descendants of these cannibals are us. Every modern human carries the genetic legacy of ancestors who, at some point in the deep past, made the choice to consume their own kind in order to survive. Whatever stories they told themselves to justify it, whatever rituals they developed to process the trauma. Whatever names they refused to speak afterward, all of it is lost. The cave floors hold the evidence, but the meaning is gone. We know our ancestors did this. We do not know how they lived with themselves afterward, or how they explained it to the children who grew up in caves, where the bones of relatives lay scattered in the corners. The walls of those caves still bear witness to a darkness that civilization has spent the last 30,000 years trying to forget. And the genetic memory of that darkness is carried, silent and dormant, in the cells of every human being alive today. Number 2, the disease that almost erased the New World. For tens of thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of the Americas lived in isolation from the populations of Eurasia and Africa. This isolation, which began when rising sea levels closed the Bering Land Bridge approximately 11,000 years ago, had profound consequences for the development of immune systems on both sides of the Pacific. The peoples of the Old World lived in dense agricultural societies surrounded by domesticated animals, and they accumulated centuries of exposure to diseases that jumped from livestock to humans. Smallpox, measles, influenza, mumps, typhus, cholera, and dozens of other pathogens evolved in the crucible of Eurasian and African civilization, killing those who had no resistance and leaving the survivors with antibodies that protected their descendants. The peoples of the Americas, separated from these disease pools, never developed those immunities. When the two worlds finally collided, the result was the greatest demographic catastrophe in human history. But here's where the story becomes truly horrifying, because the seeds of that catastrophe were planted in the deep prehistoric past. The indigenous populations of the Americas were not vulnerable because they were primitive or unhealthy. They were vulnerable because of choices their ancestors made tens of thousands of years earlier. The early humans who crossed the Bering Land Bridge brought with them only a handful of domesticated animals. The dog had been domesticated, but few of the species that would later become disease vectors in the Old World existed in the Americas. There were no cattle to spread tuberculosis, no pigs to spread influenza variants, no chickens to incubate avian diseases. The Americas were biologically clean compared to Eurasia, and that cleanliness, accumulated over thousands of years of prehistoric isolation, became a death sentence when contact finally came. What makes this particularly disturbing is the scale of what eventually happened. When European diseases arrived in the Americas in the 16th century, the death toll was almost incomprehensible. Estimates of the indigenous population of the Americas before contact range from 50 million to over 100 million people. Within 150 years of first contact, that population had collapsed by as much as 90%. Entire civilizations that had existed for thousands of years were wiped out, not by warfare or conquest alone, but by microscopic organisms that the survivors could not see, could not understand, and could not fight. Smallpox alone killed millions. Measles killed millions more. The populations of entire continents were reduced to fragments within a few generations, and the genetic and cultural diversity of half the world was lost forever. The truly unsettling aspect is the prehistoric origin of this vulnerability. The decisions made by the first Americans, tens of thousands of years ago, the animals they did and did not domesticate, the diseases they did and did not encounter, the isolation they maintained for millennia, all of it determined the outcome of a catastrophe that would not occur until thousands of years after their deaths. Their descendants inherited not only their lands and their languages, but also their immunological innocence, and that innocence killed them. The prehistoric isolation of the Americas was not a neutral fact of geography. It was a slow-motion trap that closed across 11,000 years, and the people who walked into it had no way of knowing that the conditions of their survival in the deep past were also the conditions of their destruction in the future. What makes this story particularly horrifying is the lesson it teaches about the long reach of prehistoric events. The choices our ancestors made, the environments they lived in, the species they encountered or failed to encounter, all of it continues to shape the fate of their descendants thousands of years later. Every modern population on Earth carries the legacy of prehistoric decisions, prehistoric exposures, and prehistoric isolations that determined which diseases they could survive and which would devastate them. The ghosts of the prehistoric past are not confined to museums and excavation sites. They live in our immune systems, in our genetic vulnerabilities, in the diseases that still kill some populations more than others. The catastrophe that wiped out the indigenous peoples of the Americas was set in motion not in 1492, but in the prehistoric crossing of the Bering Land Bridge. And the fingerprints of that ancient migration are still visible in the demographic shadows of the modern world. Number 1, the cognitive revolution and the death of innocence. Approximately 70,000 years ago, something happened to the human brain. Archaeological evidence from sites across Africa and the Middle East reveals a sudden explosion in human cultural complexity. Before this period, the tools and artifacts left behind by anatomically modern humans were largely indistinguishable from those of other hominin species. Stone tools were practical, simple, and slow to evolve. There was no art. Sure, there was no symbolic decoration. There was no evidence of religious belief or abstract thinking. Then, in a relatively short geological window, everything changed. Humans began creating jewelry from shell beads. They painted on cave walls. They carved figurines from ivory and bone. They buried their dead with grave goods. They developed complex tools, traded materials across hundreds of kilometers, and began to think in ways that no species on Earth had ever thought before. Historian Yuval Noah Harari called this the cognitive revolution, and it is the event that made us human in every meaningful sense. The cause of the cognitive revolution remains one of the great mysteries of human evolution. Some researchers propose that a genetic mutation, possibly involving the FOXP2 gene associated with language, suddenly enabled new forms of communication and abstract thought. Others suggest that the cognitive leap was the result of cultural innovations that built upon themselves, with each generation adding new techniques and ideas until a critical threshold was crossed. Still others argue that environmental pressure during the African mega-drought selected for individuals capable of abstract reasoning, and that the survivors of that bottleneck passed on their cognitive advantages to all subsequent generations. Whatever the cause, the consequences reshaped the planet. Within a few tens of thousands of years, a single hominin species had spread from Africa across every habitable continent, replaced or absorbed every other hominin population on Earth, and developed the cognitive infrastructure that would eventually produce agriculture, civilization, and technology. But here's where the story becomes truly disturbing. The cognitive revolution did not just give us art and language and abstract thought. It gave us the ability to imagine our own deaths. Before the cognitive revolution, no animal on Earth, as far as we can tell, possessed a clear understanding of personal mortality. Animals avoid pain and seek survival, but they do not appear to spend their lives contemplating the inevitability of their own end. Humans are different. The same cognitive capacities that allow us to plan for the future, to imagine alternatives, and to think symbolically also allow us to know, with terrible certainty, that we will die. Every burial site from the Upper Paleolithic onward bears witness to this knowledge. The grave goods, the ochre pigments scattered over the bodies, the careful positioning of the dead in fetal positions or facing east toward the rising sun, all of it represents the first attempts of conscious beings to grapple with the horror of their own mortality. The truly nightmarish aspect of the cognitive revolution is what it cost us. We gained the ability to create civilizations, but we lost the innocence of unawareness. our prehistoric ancestors became the first creatures on Earth who knew, from a young age, that they would lose everyone they loved. They became the first creatures who understood that all of their efforts would eventually be erased. They became the first creatures who looked up at the stars and felt small. The earliest religions, the earliest myths, the earliest stories about gods and afterlives all emerged from this new and terrible awareness. Every cathedral ever built, every prayer ever spoken, every philosophical treatise ever written, all of it can be traced back to the moment 70,000 years ago when human beings first realized that they were going to die and decided they could not bear to face that knowledge alone. What makes this particularly unsettling is the inheritance. Every modern human carries the cognitive equipment that emerged from the prehistoric revolution. The same brain structures that allow you to read these words, to understand their meaning, and to imagine the events they describe, also force you to know that you, too, will die. There is no escape from this awareness. There is no return to the innocent unconsciousness that preceded the cognitive revolution. We are trapped in the very minds that made us human, and the price of our intelligence is the constant background awareness that everything we love is temporary. Our prehistoric ancestors paid that price first, and they passed it down to us through every generation. The horror at the heart of the human experience is not the catastrophes that almost destroyed us. It is the awareness that came with surviving them. The awareness that was given to us by ancestors we will never know, and the awareness that we will, in turn, pass on to children who will spend their lives trying to make peace with the same darkness that has haunted our species since the moment we became ourselves. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.